Welcome to Your Music Mentor. Today, what we're going to be doing is something a little bit different. My wife is actually going to be reading questions for me to answer. And what are we talking about today? We're talking about the staff system. Why are we talking about the staff system? Quite simply, as people have been taking my Flawless course, they're able to understand the ear training aspect of it. But when it comes to things like pitch notation, people are still having a little bit of trouble. In the introductory lessons for Flawless, what I do is I actually introduce the concept of how you can actually write notes on the staff. And my hope was that over the duration of the course, you would get better at it. But I think there's still a little bit of explanation that I can provide to make it just a little bit easier for people to understand how to notate music. And the only way to do that is a little bit of theory. So what we're going to start doing here is I'm actually going to start with the basics, and we're going to cover that in this podcast. We're going to deal with the staff system today. And then we are going to gradually add to that until we have a really comprehensive understanding of the fundamentals of music theory. So I'm going to teach you a lot of music theory on select episodes within this podcast. As an aside, if you would like to take a course that only takes about 10 minutes a day, look for the Staff Speaks by Kevin Yore, that's me. This course will gradually teach you how to identify notes on the staff. It also has an ear training component, and it gives you additional information that you're not going to find in an introductory book on the staff system. So the goal of this book is to have 50 of them when it's all finished, and it's going to take you from the staff system to the most complex concepts in music theory, and it's only 10 minutes a day. So you come in, you press play, you listen to the recording, maybe you take a few notes because there is some lecture style material in there, and then you practice the exercises when they come up. Then you take a break after you complete the exercises, you come back, and you get some new exercises. So you're slowly developing your ability to identify notes on the staff more easily in both the treble and the bass clef, something we're going to talk about today, and the C clefs, another thing we're going to talk about today.
What exactly is the staff system, and what is its purpose?
The staff system is actually really important in music, and the idea here is that we've all heard stories about composers and performers and bands that just never learn to read music, and they create these epic followings. They produce this amazing music. We've all heard these stories, but those are few and far between. The staff system is essentially where we put our ideas onto paper. So if I have a simple melody that I'm listening to, bum 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 bum, I can memorize that, and then I can go to another singer in my band and I can say, okay, I want you to sing a harmony to this, and depending on the level, they may be able to do that. Or I can write it out, I can edit it, and I can put it in written form like a language so that other people can play the music as well, and so that you can honestly have more effective rehearsals. So the staff system is a really important device. It took centuries to develop. I talk more about this in my Staff Speaks course, but the basic idea here is that you have 5 lines, and those 5 lines create 4 spaces. And within those 5 lines and 4 spaces, we're able to write everything that we hear. Any piece you've ever listened to can be notated with the staff system. And there are even options for notating beyond the staff system. So our system consists of 12 pitches, and there are actually notes in between those pitches. And some musicians will use those notes, and some cultures will use those notes between pitches. You can still notate those to a degree of clarity on the staff system. So the staff system is just a very important tool that allows us to help our memories. I mean, because if you had to memorize everything you ever wrote, that would be very difficult. So what we do instead is we put it on paper, and then once it's notated, we can edit it, and we can actually do things to the staff and to the notes to make it even more polished and improve our compositions. So the staff system is really, really important. It's a great question.
What exactly is a note, and how is it represented on the staff?
Okay, this is a very important aspect of music as well. So while the staff system provides our sort of lined paper that we can use to identify whether a pitch is high or low, when we put a note on the staff system, that tells us what note to actually play. So there's really two things at play when we talk about notes. There's something called a pitch. A pitch, P-I-T-C-H, is something that we hear. It's like you throw something in baseball, well, in music, it's something we hear coming at us, right? So a pitch is something that we can hear. But how do we represent that pitch so that other people know what to play? That's called a note. When we write a small oval-shaped figure on either a line or a space on the staff system, that's called a note. So note is really a representation of pitch, which is what we hear. So there are 7 notes, and then we have other ways to make a note sound a little bit higher or a little bit lower, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the idea here is that a note is just something that you put on the staff system so that other people can play your music back. It is a representation of what we hear. And there's various ways to modify the notes to make it possible to play really complex music.
Can you explain how the lines and spaces work?
The practice of using lines and spaces to represent the pitches that we hear using notes that we put on the staff is something that is a little bit abstract, and it can be a little hard to learn at first. When we first look at a piece of music, a lot of people who have never been introduced to music have no idea what's going on. And so understanding how these lines and spaces work is really important to becoming a better musician. So the idea here is that we use a musical alphabet, and it's based on the English alphabet. The notes that we use are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. But on the staff system, for example, the bottom line in staff that we call the treble clef, because we have different clefs for each staff, the bottom line we call the note E. So if you see a staff system with 5 lines and 4 spaces, and you see a treble clef, which looks like a stylized G, the letter G, then it's kind of an uppercase G. It has a little tail on the bottom of it, but it looks like a G. Then you know that note is F. From there, if you go up to the space right next to it, so the space in between the first and the third line going from the bottom to the top, you have the note F. If you go up to the second line, you have G. If you go up to the second space, you have A, and it just keeps going up. Once we get to the note C, that's going to be the third space. We then go to D on the 4th line. Then we get another E on that top space, and then finally we have an F on the top line. And there are ways to actually extend the staff system. But what's important about all this is that the individual lines and spaces represent specific notes. And so one of the things that is a barrier to notating and reading music is learning how these notes correspond to whatever instrument you're playing. So if you're a vocalist, that's actually more difficult. You have to be able to go to a piano, unless you have perfect pitch, or some other instrument to get your starting pitch, and then you can kind of figure out the rest of the notes from there.
How do accidentals like sharps and flats affect a note?
Now that we've talked about notes and pitches, it makes sense to introduce this concept of accidentals. So an accidental it's not an accident, it's intentional. Composers will use them, they're these symbols I'm going to talk about, to raise or lower a pitch. So if I have the note C, the next note, if I go up alphabetically, is a D. But you may have noticed that on a piano there's actually these black keys and white keys. And so it's not 100% across the board. I talk about this in more detail in my course, but if you go from C up to D, that's typically a whole step, because we have 2 notes in between. So we have the C, there's a black key right next to it that's in between, and then we have D. So we count the C sharp and D, and we end up getting 2 half steps. So basically, to answer your question in the simplest way possible, if you're trying to use if you're trying to use all the keys on the piano and not just the white keys that we have on the piano, then you have to use something called a sharp and a flat. And what a sharp does is it tells you, and I'm simplifying this because there's a little more nuance in this, but it tells you to play a C, and if you have a sharp, it tells you to go up to the next key, a half step. So it raises it ever so slightly. We call that a half step. If I see a flat sign, it tells you to lower the note a half step. So that one actually takes you down to B, because if you look at a piano keyboard, the C and the B are right next to each other. There's no black key in between. So what do they look like? A sharp sign looks like a hashtag, and you always put it before the note you want it to affect. So if I want a C sharp, I put a little hashtag. It's kind of like a hashtag, but it's actually slanted just a little bit more. But a lot of people just use hashtags because it's an easy keyboard command, right? It's just Command 3 or Control 3. You can put that little hashtag in, and that will actually raise the pitch by a half step. A flat looks like a small lowercase italicized B. So if you see a little B on the music, it's not telling you the name of the note or anything. It's actually a flat sign. So a sharp is going to be the hashtag. And what do flats do? They lower it. What do sharps do? They raise it. What does a flat look like? A small b, right? Lowercase b. What does a sharp look like? A hashtag. It's slightly slanted. So I hope that answers the question there.
What are clefs, and how do they affect the staff system?
This is a really important question because I've been talking about clefs this whole time, right? Now, just as an aside, if this is really simple information for you right now, keep watching each week because we're going to keep building and this is going to get more difficult, and eventually you'll reach an episode where you learn new things, okay? Even if you know all this, you might learn something from these discussions. So very quickly, a clef. We have two main ones that we're going to deal with, and the viola players are going to hate me right now because I'm not going to talk about your clef right now. But we have something called a treble clef, which looks like a stylized uppercase G. And if you can imagine a G, kind of a cursive G, that little loop for the arm of the G, it actually wraps around the second line. Now, if you remember the discussion of notes, you'll know that the second line is a G. So that is the G line. So the treble clef, that loop in the treble clef, it actually lets you know where the G is on the staff. Now the bass clef, that deals with the notes that are lower than the treble clef. They're kind of like the lower half of the piano. So if we're relating this to a piano, you can think of the treble clef as the top half of the piano and the bass clef as the bottom half of the piano. You can almost split it in half. And what the bass clef looks like is a stylized F. So think of an uppercase F, maybe a little bit of cursive, and you've got the two arms of the F. In between, that's where you'll actually find the F line. But what they did was they took away the arms of the F and they just used two dots. So it looks kind of like a backward C on the staff system, and there's two dots that wrap around the F line. And so that's where you get the bass clef from, because it's actually a stylized F. So the names of our clefs, they have significance because they come from older versions of the letters that we write today. So G and F. And what a clef does is it lets you know if you're playing high or low. And it's really that simple. And so once you know where the notes are on the treble clef and the bass clef, then you have really expanded your awareness of how the piano works and how different instruments work.
How can someone identify notes on the staff when they're just starting out?
This is a really great question because in order to identify the names of the notes on the staff, you first need to gain a little bit of familiarity with the fact that there are lines and there are spaces. Once you can quickly recognize that, oh, the bottom line, it's in this location, the middle line is here, the top line is on the top, then the fourth line is right below that, and the second line is in between the first and the third. It sounds simple, But once you can look at notes on a staff and instantly be able to say, that's on the second line, that's on the fourth line, that's on the fifth line, that's on the first line, or that's on the third space, it makes it a lot easier to start to associate names with those locations. And so one of the things that we tend to do is we teach mnemonic devices in school. And one that I heard from one of my middle school students many, many years ago when I was teaching at an at-risk school associated, is actually affiliated, there's a difference between association and affiliation, but it was affiliated with the University of Arizona. And what she said was, every good burger deserves fries is a great mnemonic for the lines. And I think it's great because she only said that once and I still remember it to this day. So the idea here is that you want to create a mnemonic device for the lines and the spaces that make sense to you. So if every good burger deserves fries, first, second, third, fourth, fifth line, respectively, if that makes sense to you, use that. If not, come up with something that's original to you and that you can remember. And then when you see a note on the third line, go through mentally and say, every good burger. Okay, the third line's a B. And use that process. Eventually what will happen is you will just be able to recall the notes. Another great thing to do is flashcards. Flashcards can help you, and you can just have somebody else quiz you. Or you can use something like musictheory.net, has quizzes that allow you to learn the names of the notes. Also, my course, it has kind of a more interactive thing where I guide you through it, and I have you slowly and easily learn the notes. You learn like one note a day, and again, they're all like 10 minutes or less. So that's an option for you too. Now, what about the spaces? So the spaces on the treble clef there's always a fun mnemonic device that I always liked. It was, if you look between the lines, you see your face. So F, A, C, E are the spaces. F is the bottom space, A is going to be the second space, C is the third, and E is the top space. So this is a way to start learning the names of the notes. And I think it's really effective if you use a mnemonic device rather than just going alphabetically like E, F, G, A, B, C, where E is the bottom line, F is the first space, G is the second line. If you do that, then I think that you don't have the ability to quickly reference this mnemonic device and identify the notes. And so what you want to do is create as little delay as possible between seeing a note on the staff system and identifying it. And so if you're having to count E, F, G, A, B to figure out that the third line on the staff system is a B, that's going to take too long. But if you can go from lines or spaces, E, G, B, that's quicker. So you want to get to the name of the note as quick as possible. Otherwise, you'll always have a bit of a delay in your cognition of the names of the notes on the staff system.
What about the bass clef? Are there tricks to remembering those notes?
Oh, of course, yeah. The bass clef, there's tricks for that too. So again, you can just create your own mnemonic device. One that, using the burger theme, maybe you come up with a different one, but one that you could use for the lines of the bass clef is, good burgers deserve fries always. So anything that works for you. I mean, sit there and get creative. Spend a little bit of time thinking up acronyms for G, B, D, F, A, because those are the names of the lines going from the bottom line to the top line. And the bottom line is going to be the lowest one on the page, of course. So then between the lines, one that I learned when I was a kid and I never forgot it was, all cows eat grass. So you use the first letter for each one of those words. You get A, C, E, and G. So those are some tricks that will hopefully help you to learn them. But really experience and trying to identify notes as quickly as possible when you see them. Why is this important? Because you can just look at a note, which I learned as a college professor that this happens quite a bit. People got used to identifying notes and applying the correct fingering for their instrument. So if you have a D right below the staff for a trumpet player, they might not know it's a D, they just know it's the fingering 1 and 3. Or a C sharp right below that would be 1, 2, and 3. Right below that, right? So I just said that. There are ways to extend beyond the staff system. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But you can learn an instrument without ever knowing the names of the notes, and you just associate the position with a fingering instead of a letter name. However, that's not great if you ever want to notate music, and that's not great for a really profound understanding of music. So we need to know the names of the notes. We need to know that notes correlate to pitch that we hear so that we can take our understanding of music to the next level. Because you can only go so far, and in some ways you go in a different direction when you only use your ear. I mean, the ear is really important, but the music theory is equally important to allow you to understand more complex topics. It would be like trying to teach somebody to read without ever showing them the letters and what they look like. It's very difficult. You could try and explain what an A looks like, and then they may be able to associate it with an A when they see it, but it's much easier to teach them the alphabet and then show them how to pronounce words and actually read. It's the same thing with music.
Are there other clefs besides the treble and bass clefs?
Yes, there are. There's actually quite a few clefs, and if you take my Staff Speaks course, you'll see all of them, or a wide variety of them, because to say all of them, I mean, there are a lot of staffs, but the most common ones are going to be the treble and the bass. I know, sorry, violas, I'm going to talk about you now. But then the other clefs are known as C clefs. And what that means is that if you move the clef to a different location on the staff system, then it changes where something called middle C is. So middle C, if you go to a piano, it's the C that's closest to the middle of the piano. So we have a bunch of C's on the piano. If you sit right in the middle of the piano, you'll get your middle C. And what that does is it shows you where middle C is on the staff, and then you have to adjust everything in relation to middle C. So what does this clef look like? This clef looks like a backwards B, and then there's kind of another line right before that backwards B. So you kind of have this line that comes down, and then you have this backwards B. And the middle of that B, where you have the two arches that extend kind of, sideways, the middle of that tells you where middle C is. So in the alto clef, you have the arches split evenly between the top and the bottom of the staff. The arch will actually jump from the top of the staff to the third line, and then from the third line to the bottom line and create these arches. The middle, that's middle C. The tenor clef is another common clef that's used, and that one pushes it up one line. So you actually have the arch above the staff a little bit. It comes to the fourth line. That's where the arch meets the other one, and then another arch that goes down to the second line. So these are things you really have to see, but the idea here is that there are other clefs as well. But my suggestion, unless you're a violist or someone that plays in the tenor clef commonly, learn the names of the notes of the treble and the bass clef first. And my course does teach the C clefs as well, but the priority is going to be to learn the treble and the bass clef first, because that's what makes up the notes on the piano and something that we call the grand staff.
How do ledger lines work for pitches outside the staff?
Okay, imagine 5 lines. Just close your eyes and try and picture 5 lines clearly. Now, we can put all the notes that we can within those 5 lines and 4 spaces, but there's going to reach a point where we have notes that are higher or lower than the staff system and that the treble and bass clef don't accommodate for. So what do? You use something called a ledger line. So if you're in the treble clef, imagine that top line. It's an F. Now what if you were to put a note sitting right on top of that top line? That's a G. We're now extending outside the treble clef. Now imagine the bottom line of the treble clef. That's an E. Imagine a note there. Now imagine that note going down and resting just below the bottom line. It's outside the staff system. That's a D, because D comes before E. So what do we do when we want to go even lower? because if we want to go just one note outside the staff system, we don't need to do anything. We can just rest a note above or below the staff. And we just keep using our musical alphabet. If we're going up, we go up in the musical alphabet. If we go down, we have to go down. What do we do once we get to that G above the staff? Remember, it's a little note that's sitting on top of the line. And we want to go to the next note, A. What we can do is use a small line that represents a new staff line. But we don't draw an entire staff line. We don't now have 6 lines. We have a little ledger line. If we drew the entire line, all of a sudden the staff starts getting confusing because now we have 6 lines. It's almost too many for most of us to process. And then what happens if you want to go above the A? You go and you put a note sitting right on top of that little line you created. Think of it as a step above the staff system that allows you to just keep going a little bit higher. So above the B, if you want to go one more note higher, you add another ledger line, draw a circle on it, and now you have a C. So you'd have 2 ledger lines, and it's basically a way to extend the staff upwards without having to draw the line across the entire staff system. It's like adding temporary extra lines to show where these pitches are. So ledger lines are something that you'll want to see in person, and something that is not really suitable for a podcast, which is mostly audio. That's why there's no images here for those of you watching me on YouTube. But I do have exercises to teach the ledger lines as well if you take the Staff Speaks course. I know I keep talking about that, but a lot of this I go in much more detail in that course, and you can kind of get a fun little experience where you come in each day and you learn a little bit of theory every single day. And then about every week, we get exercise that we complete for 7 to 8 days usually, and then we continue. So it's kind of a fun little guided exercise you can go through.
What is the significance of middle C?
Okay, middle C. So this is actually an important question because it brings up another question that I haven't answered yet. We've talked about the musical alphabet. The musical alphabet goes from A to G, but you may have noticed that in the last slide, I said we had a G and then we had an A. Why didn't G go to H? We only have A through G for note names, and there's a reason for this, and I explained it in my course, but you have from A to G. This is the important stuff. I'm giving you the important stuff. The course gives you extra information and guides you through these exercises. So when you hit G, the musical alphabet starts over. There's a reason for that. In fact, at one point, we did have notes that went all the way to H. There were different systems that we tried. But the idea here is that we have A to G, and then the notes start over. And part of that is because if I play a C here, and I play another C, they kind of sound similar. What if I play a C and an E? The E sounds different. And so when we come to these notes with the same letter name again, they're called octaves, and they allow us to kind of have similar pitches that are just in different octave registers. So that's part of the reason. But the significance of middle C, on a very basic level, it is the C in the middle of the piano. So if you go to a piano, you kind of situate yourself in the middle of it, and you press that C, you have just found middle C. The other part of it is that C is exactly between the treble and the bass clef. It's a fifth below the G in the treble clef, C to E, F, G. Here's your G in the treble clef. 1, down to F, down to E, that's 3. Here's your D, and here's your C. So it's a fifth below the G. It's also a fifth above the F. Remember the 4th line of the bass clef. F, G, A, B, and C. So it's middle C because it's between the G in the treble clef and the F in the bass clef. And it has one ledger line for both the treble and the bass clef. So if you see one ledger line and it's a treble clef and it's below the staff, it is a C. If you see one ledger line and it's in the bass clef and it's above the staff, It's C. We call that middle C. So I hope that explains it a little bit.
What is a rhythm, and why is it so important in music?
So far, we've been talking only about notes and pitches, but rhythm is what gives action to those notes and pitches. If I just have a bunch of pitches, they're just kind of floating in space. I don't know what their rhythm is. Sorry, having fun here. So they just float in space. They don't have any time associated with them. Rhythm allows us to add time to it. So if I have the note C, D, E, F, G, and I want to play them using a particular rhythm that any musician can read and play it accurately, I can notate the rhythm, and then they'll have a particular timing to each of the notes. So this might be an example of how it might be played when I apply rhythm to the notes. You notice how some notes are faster and slower than others. So rhythm really is determined by something called pulse. So pulse is a metrical division of time. You just try and make it as consistent as possible, and you can speed up or slow down. That changes the metrical division of time. But the idea is that the pulse is steady. So my rhythm there that I played, bum, 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 bum. It allows us to use the pulse to determine how to play the rhythm. And that's something we'll talk a little bit more about because it's a little more complex.
Can you explain note durations and their symbols?
Yeah, so basically a whole note lasts for 4 beats. So what's a beat? It's a steady pulse. So I can pick a pulse at any tempo. I can go, or I can go slow. The important thing, and this is something that musicians train, is you want to be able to have a consistent pacing. So think of it as seconds on a clock. 60 beats per minute is going to be 1 beat or 1 pulse every second. If you have 120 beats per minute, there's 2 pulses for every second. So it's a lot faster. So the pulse can speed up or slow down, but that pulse, which I'm going to call a beat now because it's really the beat that we're talking about, the beat allows us to read music and figure out how long we should hold these notes for. So the first note value that all the other ones are really based on is called a whole note. W-H-O-L-E, whole, okay? So a whole note is worth 4 beats. So if this is my tempo, I would sing, ba. I held it for 4 beats. A half note is 2 beats, so it's half the value of a whole note. That's where we get the half note from. It's half a whole note. Quarter notes are a quarter the value of a whole note, so they're going to occur on every beat. Bum, 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 bum. And then we have eighth notes, which are an eighth of the value of the whole note. So that means there's going to be 8 for every whole note. So we have to play in between the beats. Bum, 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 bum. So these note values, they keep going and getting faster and they double. You'll notice went from whole to half to quarter to eighth. Well, guess what the next one is? 16th note. So it'll be 16 notes for every whole note, and there will be 4 for each beat. Bum, 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 bum. And then we can keep making them faster and faster. We can have 32nd notes, 64th, 128th, 256, 512, 1028, or 1024. We don't actually have 1024 notes, but for any of you involved with computers, you know that at least at one point, RAM used to work that way as well, where you'd have like 8, 16, So this is how we identify how long to hold a note. And there are additional considerations because you can add a dot to a note, which takes half the original value and adds it to the end, so it makes it 150% the note value. So if you have a whole note with a little dot on the end of it, it ends up being worth 6 beats. But these are things that you can kind of learn gradually. You can get a book on how to actually read music. In this second book of my Staff Speaks series, we're actually going to talk about rhythm. I'm going to teach you how to read it in detail, but that one's not available yet. Right now, it's only the first course. It lasts about 90 to 100 days.
What are rests and how do they work?
Well, that reminds me, Mozart said, music is in the silence. And why does that matter? Because, or at least he's attributed to that quote, but the idea here is that a rest is the opposite of a note, right? A note creates a pitch that we hear. A rest is an opportunity to stop playing, which is really important for a lot of reasons. I mean, if you're writing a piece, you don't want it to have all notes all the time. You want to give some rest to the players and to allow the music to breathe a little bit. So a rest is a symbol that indicates silence in music, and each rest matches a note value. So you can have a whole rest, a half rest, a quarter rest, an eighth rest, 16th, 32nd, 64th, and so on. So we have equivalent rests for every note value that we have.
How do time signatures help organize rhythm?
Time signatures are really important, and this is where it gets a little bit difficult to explain this. It'd be easy to show you. But essentially, we have a clef at the beginning of a staff system, and then we have two numbers, one on the top half and one on the bottom half of the staff system. The top number tells you how many beats are in what we call a measure, and that's just a unit of time. The bottom number tells you what beat is worth, what note value is worth one beat. So the top number is the number of beats in the measure. The bottom number is the note value that gets one beat. Okay, so what does that mean? So if you have a 4 on the top and a 4 on the bottom in your time signature, it's telling you there are 4 beats in a measure. In a measure, we just add a little line to separate the notes from the next measure. So that top number tells you there's 4 beats in the measure, and the bottom number is actually a fraction. So if you turn the top number into a 1, in 4/4 time, you'll get 1/4. Turn that 4 into a 1. So that tells you the quarter note gets 1 beat. So what if you had a 4/8? What note value would be worth 1 beat, and how many notes are in the measure? Or how many beats are in the measure? There would be 4 beats in the measure, and the 8th note gets 1 beat. For the 16th note, if the 16th note was worth 1 beat, you'd have maybe a 4/16, a 3/16. Let's go ahead and say 5/16. So 5 on the top, 16 on the bottom. How many beats are there in the measure? 5. And what note value is worth 1 beat? So here, what note value is worth 1 beat? The 16th, because you take that 5, turn it into a 1, you get 1/16. So this is something that is hard for you to just completely grasp in a conversation like this, but it's a starting point. And then you have to start reading music in different time signatures and get used to counting in these time signatures.
What's a measure and why is it important?
Measures divide music up into smaller, more manageable chunks of time. So let's say you have a 4/4 time signature. 4 beats in the measure, quarter note is worth 1 beat. In order to make it easier to read, after the 4 beats have elapsed, imagine your 5 lines and 4 spaces. Picture that staff system. Now picture a vertical line that cuts through those 5 lines and 4 spaces. That vertical line will separate each measure of 4 beats. So if we have a piece in 4/4 time, we use a measure or a bar line in between each one of those 4 beat sections. So the line is actually called a bar line. The space in between is a measure because it is a measurement of time. In this case, it's a measurement of 4 beats. So if you're playing at 60 beats per minute, then it's a measurement of 4 seconds of time. So that's all it is. It's kind of like what you see on a ruler, how you have those little ticks to indicate different measurements and they're equally spaced. We do the same thing in music. In fact, music really is a ruler because you can break an inch into quarters, right? Well, if you're in 4/4 time, each one of those quarter note measurements, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, they indicate a quarter note. There's also eighth of an inch, right? Each one of those eighth-inch increments represent an eighth note. So you can really relate it to an actual tape measure, and it is a unit of time.
What's the difference between simple and compound time?
Okay, simple and compound time. This is kind of complex. No pun intended. So with time signatures, we can break them up into simple or compound meters, or simple and compound time signatures. Meters, the same thing as a time signature. Two words, kind of the same thing. So the idea behind simple time is that each beat can be divided up into two smaller parts. With compound time, each beat can be divided up into three parts. And this lets us know how to interpret a time signature. Now, a simple way of looking at a time signature and knowing if it's simple or compound is look at the top number. Is there a 2, a 3, or a 4? If the answer is yes, it's simple. If there is a 3, 6, or 9, or 12, then it's compound. So the way this works, and then everything else would fall under complex. The way this works is if you have 4/4 time and you have a quarter note, typically that quarter note gets divided into two eighth notes. And we have 4 beats in the measure. In compound time, and this is more complex, this is why I'm going to explain this in more detail in my course, the upcoming one. But in compound time, what you have is if you have a 6, you have to divide that 6 in half, and you end up getting 2. You get 2 parts. And so each one of those parts has 3 beats in it. And what we tend to do is we will conduct compound time in 2 or 3. So if you have a 6/8 time signature, you cut that 6 in half, we would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where 1 and 4 are really beats 1 and 2. In simple time, it's more straightforward. Each beat has 2 beats, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So this is a good question, but it's not really necessary for understanding how to read music at this point in time. What we want to do is focus on learning the note values and the note names at this point, and just using a steady beat to make sure we can play in time. And then compound time signatures can be expressed in more detail at a later point in time.
How can beginners practice reading rhythms?
I suggest that beginners start with very simple time signatures like 4/4, 3/4, and 2/4. In fact, my practice dictations do just that. They, in the beginning, only deal with 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4 time. We don't add 6/8 and other more complex time signatures until later. Actually, technically, 6/8 is not a complex time signature. It's a compound, but in relation to simple time signatures, they're more complex. Kind of gets confusing, and it's based on context. But what you do is you pick a piece, it's like in 4/4, you can get a rhythm book, and you just clap the rhythms. You set a metronome. So a metronome is a device that allows you to set a tempo, so you can set it to maybe 60 beats per minute, and then it starts ticking. And then once you get that beat in your head, you know how long to hold a quarter note or an eighth note, things of that nature. This, for those of you that can see, and those of you that can't, it's not a big deal, but this is a metronome. It's an older metronome. In fact, it doesn't need batteries. You just wind it, and then you set the dial to how many beats per minute you want. And so here we've got it set at 72. So if I start ticking it, if I let it go, it gives me a steady beat. So now I can play quarter notes. I can play eighth notes. I can play 16th notes. So what you can do to start is practice just clapping quarter notes or singing quarter notes, and then practice clapping or singing eighth notes. What you'll find is the metronome speeds up and slows down. That's kind of a joke, but it can happen where, like, I think my metronome's speeding up or slowing down. It's just that you're not pacing yourself properly. So before you even approach notated music, just practice the beat, singing quarter notes. When I would teach in middle school, what I do is I'd actually have the students march around the room in tempo to a steady beat, and then later we'd make it more complex. But the idea here is that you want to get that metrical kind of even timing in your system before you start reading more complex music. Once you know how to clap a quarter note, a whole note, a half note, an eighth note, and a 16th note in relation to a metronome, look for some music that's in 4/4, 3/4 time, preferably with a recording, and clap along. So this is something we're going to spend a lot of time on in the second unit of the Staff Speaks, because I'm going to take you through simple time signatures and compound time signatures. So you'll truly understand what simple and compound is then. But right now, I'm sure if you've never heard those terms before, you don't know what simple or compound is yet. And some of you who do know what simple or compound are may have objections to my oversimplification of it. But again, this is kind of like an introduction. And as we all know, when we're first introduced to something, we make it simple. And then we can start to add additional clarifications to it. It's like this idea in music theory. If you have a chord at the beginning of the measure, and then you play an interval on the next beat, well, I knew that first chord was major. The second chord is also major. Even though it's missing the third that tells us a quality, there are certain things that we learn as we become more advanced, and this is one of them. But what I recommend is getting that internal sense of rhythm down first, where you can clap whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, 16ths, eighth notes. And then once you can do that, look for some sheet music that you can slowly practice. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me. And next time we're going to cover scales and key signatures, and we're going to keep introducing new concepts as we go. So in the week that you have off, maybe you should go and try and investigate these topics a little bit more in depth. So you can learn about notes, the other things we talked about, the staff system, and understanding rhythm. Get a metronome and start just clapping beats in tempo. Remember, those are going to be your quarter notes. Then start clapping eighth notes. We can make it more complex once you learn how to count in relation to the whole note when the whole note is worth 4 beats. And then once you learn that, we can add compound time signatures. We can get more complex. But for now, you just want to get that sense of rhythm and start to understand how to read notes on the staff system. And again, a good resource for that, I go into a lot of detail. It's 100 lectures just on teaching you the names of the notes in both the treble, bass, and also the C clefs. But it also goes beyond that because it includes audiation, it includes ear opening exercises, and it tells you, it starts the process of having you identify notes by ear. So that's a really fun thing. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next time where we have another podcast, and I hope you'll join us. And please share this with your friends if you found it useful or you think you know of someone that would be interested in learning about these concepts. And I hope to see you again.